Hey there, everybody. Jeff Dalick here with Our Curious World, bringing you another story of the mysterious, the unexplained, and the just plain weird. While I'm not a conspiracy theory buff, I nonetheless find studying them to be fascinating. And one I've always found most perplexing is the theory that the Apollo 11 moon landings were faked. In fact, it is one of the most enduring of all conspiracy theories, with a 2022 study by the University of New Hampshire showing that 12% of adults in the U.S. do not believe it happened, and another 19% said they're unsure. That's nearly a third of the population either considering it untrue or unsure of whether it's true, and that's a lot of people. So is there anything to it? No, let's get into it and find out. First, as I just stated, I am not a conspiracy buff. I generally find most of them to be silly or, at best, lacking in logical consistency. Actually, I consider myself something of a debunker, though it's not a major element of my writings. I do, however, enjoy pondering how someone comes up with, and more remarkably, manages to defend their position when the facts seem to be so clearly stacked against them. It takes a particular intellectual obstinance to hold to a belief when it can be so easily refuted, making those that so steadfastly hold to their worldview a breed of their own, and indeed a mystery to behold. Secondly, my goal here is not to try and talk you out of your beliefs. Conspiracy theorists can rarely be persuaded into changing their position through logical discourse. Plus, I have neither the patience nor the inclination to try and do so here. Instead, my purpose in this video is to simply ask a few questions, see what sort of response I get, or at very least, get my viewer to look at the bigger picture in regards to this particular issue. Okay, with those disclaimers out of the way, if you haven't already clicked off or even given me the dreaded thumbs down, let's look at one of the most enduring and long-lived conspiracy theories out there, and that is that NASA faked the Apollo 11 moon landing. The rationale for doing so, at least according to those who maintain this belief, is because NASA found itself in something of a pickle in the aftermath of the tragic Apollo 1 fire that left 3 astronauts dead. It seems that despite its best efforts, it simply couldn't achieve the goal of putting a man on the moon in the ridiculous short time span that was forced upon it. Fearing losing both funding and public support by admitting failure, as well as being conscious of the blow to America's prestige around the world if it was unable to deliver the goods, NASA decided the best option was simply fake the landings using state-of-the-art special effects. That would, if nothing else, at least buy some time as they continue to tackle the technical and engineering problems getting a man to the lunar surface entailed, while maintaining America's status as a space science superstar. Of course, having a motive is not enough. Faking the moon landing would have taken a lot of money, which NASA had. A lot of scientific expertise, also something that NASA clearly possessed. But the real problem was that it would have required a voluntary cooperation and sworn secrecy of hundreds, maybe even thousands of scientists, engineers, technicians, and special effects artists to pull off. That would be a much more difficult feat, but let's suppose for the sake of argument that NASA has somehow managed to keep their notorious little secret to this very day. So how would they go about pulling off one of the greatest deceptions in history? For a demonstration of how it might have been done, we only have to look to Hollywood for the answer. In 1977, Warner Brothers released a science fiction adventure film entitled Capricorn 1, starring James Brolin, Hal Holbrook, Elliot Gould, Sam Waterston, and O.J. Simpson, that depicted how NASA managed to produce a faked Mars mission. Of course, while the movie worked around the premise of a faked Mars mission, it was clear to even the most casual observer that was really about how one might contrive a faked moon mission. Why? Because it was obvious that 3 men could not have endured the nearly 2-year-long flight to Mars and back confined in an Apollo-sized capsule. But hey, Hollywood is rarely concerned about such small details like plausibility. The plot itself is pretty straightforward action-adventure stuff. Just minutes before the Capricorn 1 spacecraft was about to lift off from Mars, some guy in a suit opens the capsule door and orders the 3 astronauts out of the capsule. The rocket then takes off without them, leaving the 3 astronauts watching from the confines of a secure room, naturally wondering what the hell is happening. The head of NASA, in this case played by Hal Holbrook, explains that the life support system they were outfitted with would have failed long before reaching Mars, and so the decision was made to essentially fake the mission for the reasons I articulated earlier. Further, Holbrook's threat that something bad might befall their families if they didn't play along forces the three men to cooperate in the deception, and they participate in the ruse even to the point of stepping foot on a fake Martian surface and raising a flag, thereby convincing the world and all but a small and evil cadre within NASA and the government that NASA had brilliantly achieved its goal. Upon the return to Earth, however, the empty spacecraft burns up during re-entry, supposedly killing everyone on board, and signaling to the astronauts that the authorities will need to kill them to keep the hoax a secret. Breaking out of their desert prison, they manage to escape in a small jet, which quickly runs out of fuel, forcing a crash landing in the desert, after which they split up on foot to increase their chances of finding help and exposing the entire deception. Though two of the three astronauts were quickly recaptured, James Brolin's character actually succeeds in returning to civilization and even appears at his own memorial service to spill the beans. Exciting stuff and a really cool ending. In any case, the movie was a big hit, and I admit having enjoyed it when I was a kid, even though I never for a moment believed any of the storyline. Still, it's fun to watch. Unfortunately, the movie had the effect, whether intentional or otherwise, of justifying the moon landing denier's suspicions, making Capricorn 1 not only a clear demonstration as to how such a feat could have been achieved, but providing a major boost to the fake moon landing conspiracy, still largely in its infancy at the time. As such, it is still referred to today as practically a documentary on how to hoax such an extraordinary event, and remains a favorite among moon landing deniers to this day. Of course, there are notable differences between the plot in Capricorn 1 and the allegedly faked Apollo 11 landing. The most important of these is, while in the Hollywood epic the three astronauts are unwitting and unwilling pawns in NASA's nefarious scheme, the Apollo 11 astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, were supposedly complicit in the deception. Additionally, unlike the movie, all three astronauts make it back safely to Earth, where they remain silent to this day in regards to their deception. Well, actually, both Armstrong and Collins have since passed, without a deathbed confession, I might add, while Aldrin is still going strong at 95 and still maintaining that he and Armstrong really did walk on the moon. Of course, he has to say that, doesn't he? So how about it? Is there potentially a kernel of truth to the idea that the moon landings never happened, and we have all been duped by one of the greatest deceptions in history? Normally, when people try to debunk this idea, they do so by examining each of the deniers' specific objections, such as why were there no stars in the sky in the Apollo 11 photos, and why the shadows are all wrong, and why the American flag appears to be flapping in the wind on an atmosphere-free moon. But I'm not going to go into any of that. There are already a number of excellent videos out there that do a good job debunking each of these issues, so there's no point in me going over them again. And by the way, Mythbusters did an excellent episode on this in case you're interested. It's very thorough, so go check it out. What I am more interested in is asking the bigger questions that a potentially fake moon landing raises that I have seldom heard asked. What questions are those? Well, I thought you'd never ask. So, without further ado, here are my 5 questions for moon landing deniers that I would like them to answer. Question 1. Did NASA have the ability to get humans to the moon in 1969? Remember that prior to Apollo 11, there were 4 manned missions, 2 of which, Apollo 8 and Apollo 10, actually put men into lunar orbit. Did that really happen, or was that also faked? This is an important question to answer for 2 reasons. 1, some contend that humans could never survive traveling through the Van Allen radiation belt that encircles our planet. So if these missions actually occurred, it proved that such a belief is erroneous and destroys a major objection to getting to the moon. Second, if the Apollo 8 and 10 missions were not faked, it demonstrates that NASA had the capacity to actually send a manned craft to the moon and back, making the prospect of landing on the moon's surface not so far-fetched. Question 2. Were the subsequent moon landings that followed Apollo 11 also faked? It seems to me that if NASA was intent on faking the moon landing, once they pulled it off, they would have canceled any further lunar missions and simply sat on their laurels. But that was not the case. There were 5 successful follow-on missions to the lunar surface over the next 3 years, each of which explored ever larger swaths of the lunar surface. If those were faked as well, and logic dictates that they must be in order for the conspiracy theory to remain internally consistent, that would mandate the necessity of not only somehow managing to fake another 5 landings, but of constructing ever larger and more elaborate sound stages, especially on those missions in which the lunar rover was employed. Consider that the 3 lunar rovers eventually skidded across the lunarscape, traveling a combined distance of 56 miles over the course of 3 missions, with the Apollo 17 rover covering an astonishing 22 miles by itself. That would require sound stages hundreds or even thousands of acres in size, and all that carried out with only the special effects materials and techniques available in 1970, and likely employing hundreds if not thousands of workers to construct. Naturally, this would complicate things exponentially, vastly increase the chances of being uncovered, and require the continued sworn secrecy of ever-growing numbers of participants and co-conspirators. Of course, one way around this problem is to maintain that while Apollo 11 flight was faked, NASA could have gotten its act together and really landed astronauts on the subsequent missions. Of course, this would be logically inconsistent and naturally beg the question as to why, if they really could land men on the moon just 4 short months after the Apollo 11 hoax, they couldn't have done it earlier. In effect, taking this route undercuts the entire hoaxed moon landing theory by admitting that NASA really could, and in fact did, land men on the moon only later and not in July of 1969. If this is the case, why hoax the landing at all? The traditional answer is that NASA was under immense political pressure to get a man on the moon by the end of the decade, per President Kennedy's 1961 target date. And since Apollo 11 wasn't truly capable of the task at the time, NASA officials were forced to fake it till they make it. However, if true, and Apollo 11 really wasn't capable of making a moon landing, that wouldn't have been catastrophic for either NASA or America. NASA could have simply aborted the Apollo 11 landing and left it for the Apollo 12 crew to do the deed a few months later. Remember, Apollo 12 reputedly landed on the lunar surface in November of 1969, which was well within Kennedy's timeline, so there would have been no dishonor had Apollo 11 not been able to make it to the moon earlier that year. America would have still won the space race, and NASA's funding would have remained secure, eliminating the need to fake a landing. Plus, would anyone really have been devastated if they didn't make it to the moon until 1970? After all, Kennedy's date was entirely arbitrary, and missing the prescribed date would not have taken away from the technological achievement the landings entailed. I'm sure JFK wouldn't have minded. Question 3. If all the Apollo missions were faked, what was the deal with Apollo 13? We all know Apollo 13 suffered an in-flight explosion that prevented it from making a moon landing and very nearly cost the entire crew their lives, a story which was recounted in Ron Howard's excellent movie Apollo 13 in 1995. So what was the point of this? I mean, if each mission was a carefully orchestrated Hollywood production, each should have gone off flawlessly with, maybe a few minor issues for the sake of dramatic effect. So did NASA manufacture a fake in-flight explosion to elicit better ratings and introduce more drama into their bogus missions? Of course, by the time Apollo 13 took off in April of 1970, interest in the moon landings had waned a bit. So maybe an in-flight emergency would have been just the sort of nail-biting drama audiences would eat up. Unfortunately, and even if it did briefly renew interest in what NASA was doing, that didn't last long. By the time Apollo 16 and 17 had landed on the surface, ratings had dropped once more, a factor which might have even played a role in the government's decision to cancel the Apollo 18 and 19 missions and end moon landings permanently. Question 4. How does one manage to keep such a massive cover-up quiet for so long? As I alluded to earlier, the moon landings involved the participation of literally thousands of people. So how is it that no credible participant, not a single guilt-ridden scientist, a single compromised engineer, or a lone special effects expert has ever stepped forward in 6 decades to admit to their nefarious deeds. Additionally, how many of the men and women who worked in the Apollo mission have since passed on, and yet we don't have a single deathbed confession? Doesn't that seem a little unlikely? I don't know. Maintaining a cover-up of the size and complexity required for something like a faked moon landing would have necessitated a veil of secrecy so vast and so airtight that it has never been breached, which would be a feat more difficult to pull off than a fake moon landing itself. It's simply not plausible. I mean, even the most carefully guarded secrets, the Manhattan Project, the D-Day invasion, the creation of milk duds, were able to maintain for only a short time, maybe a few months or a year or two at most. Once the atomic bombs were detonated over Japan and the beaches of Normandy were secured, when milk duds hit the store shelves in 1928, the jig was up and truth quickly emerged. However, in the case of the hoaxed moon landings, the secret has been kept for over 55 years, and apparently still going strong today, making it the most impressive cover-up in human history. And finally, question 5. How do you explain the hard and confirmable evidence that human beings have been on the moon? Were the moon landings real, there should be evidence to that effect in the form of the discarded lunar descent stages, the rovers, and other equipment being left behind. For that matter, in the vacuum of space, even the astronauts' footprints should still be visible, undisturbed by erosion or winds as they would be on Earth, but perfectly preserved on an atmosphereless moon. And in fact, that is exactly the case. Obviously, we can't see the lunar landing sites from Earth through even the most powerful telescopes, but in 2009, NASA launched the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, to more precisely map the surface of the moon. And this satellite actually can see each landing site, including that of Apollo 11, by the way, with considerable clarity, even to the point of being able to make out flags and the footprints and rover tracks the astronauts left behind. That, in and of itself, should be enough to quell any doubts, but alas, for the hardcore lunar landing denier, even that isn't enough. There's always the possibility, they will maintain, that the LRO satellite itself is just another clever attempt by NASA to continue to cover their tracks decades later. Of course, other countries have also launched lunar orbiting satellites that have captured similar images, which would seem to refute this idea, but then they too could be in cahoots with NASA to cover up the truth, making this not just an American deception, but a global one as well. I also wonder, one would think the old Soviet Union, having lost the space race, would have loved to uncover NASA's deception and humiliate the U.S. at the time, but even they seem to have fallen for NASA's skullduggery. As if imagery from the LRO isn't enough to convince you that humans really did land on the moon, there is one piece of equipment left on the lunar surface that can easily confirm it. It seems that the crews of Apollo 11, 14, and 15 left retroreflectors on the lunar surface as part of the lunar laser ranging experiment. For those who aren't familiar with this piece of technology, a retroreflector is a device that reflects light back to its source with minimum scattering, making it possible to bounce a laser beam off the surface of the moon and back to Earth, thereby confirming the presence of a man-made object on the lunar surface. As such, anyone with the proper equipment and appropriate knowledge can determine for themselves that human beings really have been on the moon. There was even an episode of Big Bang Theory actually that demonstrated how this was done, in case you want to check it out. In my opinion, this last point is what really drives the proverbial nail through the coffin in regards to the fake moon landing theory. One can quibble about timelines and government pressure and special effect capabilities all they want, but how does one ignore that which is easily discernible to anyone who is truly interested in finding out? The bases of the lunar landers, the footprints, the retroreflectors, and everything else the astronauts left behind were not somehow put onto the moon later just to continue to fool the public. They were put there decades ago and have been there ever since, and serve as clear proof that man has walked on the surface of the moon. Of course, you're free to ignore all that if you wish, but to what end? Is maintaining your beliefs more important than learning the truth, or could simply be a question of refusing to admit that you've made a mistake? I guess how you answer that says a lot about yourself. Look, I recognize that conspiracy theories can be great fun and definitely help give one a sense of intellectual superiority for not blindly believing the same things everyone else does, but they can also be dangerous. How? Let's take a lesson from history. In 1903, a pamphlet first appeared in Imperial Russia entitled The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It purported to be a detailed Jewish plot for global domination. Largely plagiarized from several earlier sources, it was eventually translated into multiple languages and disseminated internationally in the early part of the 20th century, when it played a key role in popularizing belief in an international Jewish conspiracy. Though exposed as a clear forgery as early as 1921, it was believed by literally millions of people around the world and was a factor in not only the rise of the Nazis, but of the Holocaust itself. While an anti-Semitic plot for world domination doesn't compare to a much more benign belief in a fake moon landing, disregard for the facts is destructive in terms of the damage it does to faith in science and to history, as well as to common sense itself. Fortunately, we live in a country in which one is free to believe what as they wish, but such is not done in a vacuum. Your beliefs can have consequences, and while belief in a fake moon landing may not have the same consequences believing anti-Semitic propaganda portends, none of it is useful if one's goal is to learn the truth. So if you like this video, I'd really appreciate if you hit that like button and maybe consider subscribing to see more stories like this from our curious world. I'm new to YouTube and really need your help to get this channel to grow so I can bring you more wacky, weird, and bizarre stuff like this. So here's your final thought for the day. A good conspiracy is unprovable. I mean, if you can prove it, it means that someone screwed up somewhere along the line. Until next time, bye.